Thank you for the opportunity to address the Scottish Housing Policy Conference. This is a brief video, and rent control is a complex subject. There are literally hundreds of academic papers on the subject and hundreds more policy and advocacy documents. I have a few slides I'll present, and I have a somewhat larger version of this, which is available upon request. The larger version includes sources and recommended readings. I strongly recommend you read some of the excellent recent reviews of controls, especially those by Ken Gibb and his associates, and by Christine Whitehead and Peter Williams. I want to start by briefly touching on some current events that provide context for our discussion. Then I'll summarize a few points about economists' views on rent controls, drawing on some of the classic as well as more recent literature. I'll then focus specifically on housing supply and its interaction with controls. I'll finish up with a few questions that I hope we can address at this conference. We've all seen versions of these photos, and many of us have been in these meetings. Rent control is a contentious policy, and it's easy to find passionate voices on both sides of the debate. Some forms of rent control have been with us for decades, in fact, for centuries. Many countries now have controls, and we are apparently in an upward phase of the popularity of controls in many markets, including parts of my home country of the United States. We also need to mention the elephant in the room. For the past 2 years, housing markets and the health and employment and incomes of the households that live in them have been battered by the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't have separate data for Scotland, but Britain has been hard hit by the pandemic, as has the United States. I'm not going to delve into the pandemic itself further today because that would take us too far afield. I did recently publish a paper for Contemporary Economic Policy that reviewed how housing markets reacted in the first year of the pandemic. This chart from that paper shows that the United Kingdom, denoted GBR in the chart, had a fairly modest increase in rents, both in the year before the pandemic and in the first year of the pandemic. I haven't charted more recent data yet, but I have examined it. And to my knowledge, aggregate UK rent growth has remained fairly modest in the second year of the pandemic. While the pandemic has imposed enormous costs on households in any number of ways, including obviously, but not limited to, the deaths just noted, many countries stepped up with emergency measures, including a number of subsidies and other policy actions on the housing front. This didn't completely eliminate pandemic-related housing problems, but it has surely mitigated them. I'll speed through the next 4 or 5 charts, since this audience will be familiar with rents in Scotland and the UK. I'll simply note that rents in the UK and its constituent countries have risen during the pandemic, but fairly modestly compared to some other countries. My initial impression is that Britain's housing affordability problems, and presumably Scotland's, may be more a problem of stagnant and declining real incomes than problems of rapid real rent growth, although I'm certain we will find particular markets and certainly many households where rapidly rising rents greatly exceed the national averages. In the event, the government of Scotland is considering imposing a new system of rent controls and related regulations. My understanding of this effort is based on the draft strategy consultation paper, A New Deal for Tenants, published just a few months ago. Traditionally, economists as a group are far from keen on rent controls, and this quotation from William Grant while dated, is representative. Simple supply and demand analysis suggests that if controls are placed on a rental housing market and there is any responsiveness on the supply side, controls will call forth a reduction in the supply of rental housing, creating a shortage, and possibly having other unintended consequences, some of which we'll discuss momentarily. Real-world rent controls and their collateral regulations are often complicated things, and sometimes the simple textbook analysis is insufficient. The best point of entry into the next level of economic analysis is a classic 1995 paper by my friend Richard Arnott. Richard and perhaps a dozen other housing economists began to study rent control in more details in the 1980s and 1990s and found that simple supply and demand models, while a great starting point, didn't always incorporate important features of actual controls. I've taken this quotation from his classic paper. I heartily agree with the first sentence. I think the second sentence is also a fair statement. I think the third sentence is a little strong. For what it's worth, let's have a quick look at a recent poll of leading economists. The University of Chicago regularly polls about 40 well-known economists from a range of fields on a wide range of subjects. While one can quibble over the way they worded this particular question, only one of the 41 economists polled indicated a positive view of controls. It should be noted that the economists polled weren't specialists in housing economics. Thanks to Ken Gibb and colleagues, here's the familiar standard representation of the textbook model of rent controls that predicts reduced rent, but at the cost of a shortage of rental housing. And here's a brief summary of Arnott's critique. Richard points out that the standard model examines a static rent ceiling and does not explicitly model second generation rent control regimes. Such a regime might start off with an initial market rent, but then limits are placed on rent increases going forward. Many variations on the theme are possible. A simple one might index allowable rent changes to some broad consumer price index. There are many variations on the theme, many disparate elements that make up any particular second generation rent control system. In the end, markets do adjust in some fashion. There are a number of ways this can happen, as shown here. Konstantin Kolodan, an economist in a think tank in Berlin, recently surveyed empirical studies on rent controls. Different studies examine different effects. The most widespread finding, perhaps unsurprising, is that controls reduce rents in 15 of 19 studies. In a few others, they didn't seem to have much effect. In addition, 6 of 7 studies found that spillover effects raise rents in the uncontrolled portion of the rental market. On those that looked at supply, half, 5 of 10, found negative effects on new construction, but 8 of 9 who looked at the existing stock found negative effects on quality, or the quality of housing services provided by that stock. 12 of 12 studies that examined mobility found that rent controls reduced household mobility. 9 of 13 studies found that rent control lowered rentership rates. Many other studies could be discussed if we had time, but today we're going to focus on the supply side. There are 3 broad ways to categorize sources of supply. Do you own or rent? What does it mean to own or rent? Are the suppliers public entities, private, or something in between? And is the supply coming from new construction or the existing stock? We're going to focus on new construction versus the existing stock today, with a little more attention at first on new construction. Let's take a look at new construction with some simple exploratory data analysis. These are some plots I did of US metropolitan areas. These are markets without controls, and these are markets with controls. So this is Washington, D.C., Oakland, San Jose, Camden, San Francisco. New York is sort of lumped in here somewhere. I know these are a little hard to read. Comparing these two charts, what's obvious is that the intercept or baseline level of per capita permits and the coefficient where the permits keep up with population growth and the R squared of the regression equation, or how strongly these things are correlated, are all higher for the uncontrolled markets. So at least in the US, and this is a crude piece of data work, rent-controlled markets build less housing per capita. That's interesting, but we should remember that these simple plots don't control for anything except population and the presence of controls. Among other things, we're not yet controlling for other determinants of supply, including other land use and development regulations, about which more in the next slide. For some insights here, we can turn to a paper where I developed some measures of several land use and development regulations for US metropolitan areas back in 1996. These included, but were not limited to, a very simple dummy variable for the presence of rent controls. The non-rent control measures were based on metro and state level information on things like the time required for regulatory approvals, what sort of state environmental rules were in place, and so on. This table presents the basic regression for metro level building permits normalized by population. The key result for our purposes is that even after controlling for other development regulations, metro areas with rent controls had lower total housing construction. In a second stage, I defined an arbitrarily lightly regulated city and a heavily regulated city by calculating the first quartiles of regulatory indexes, which are labeled here a little bizarrely, SREG 1, reg test, and a reg squared. The heavily regulated city would be one where these took on the third quartile of the sample values. So you'd be moving from the middle of the bottom half of the distribution to the middle of the top half, if you want to think about it that way. And then, since rent control is a dummy variable, you're either controlled or you're not. Taken together, changing those state and metro level land use variables from the first to the third quartile variables and adding in rent control reduced normalized building permits by 42%. Where does Scotland and or Britain stand when compared to other countries in terms of how well the housing system responds overall to demand? Gibbon and colleagues, Turner and Malpezzi and many other rent control papers note that this price responsiveness or supply elasticity is one of the key underlying characteristics of any housing market, and it's a key to affordability among many other things. Several cross-country comparisons estimate low elasticities, that is low responsiveness, for British housing markets, including a paper I worked on some years ago with our colleague Duncan McLennan. Here's a representative result from a more recent OECD study, finding a fairly low, not the lowest, supply elasticity or responsiveness for the United Kingdom. And when you plot this against a crude and somewhat debatable measure of the regulatory environment, this is just one rough measure from some World Bank surveys, you find that the UK, here labeled GBR, is sort of in the middle of the pack on the regulatory variable, but is down near the bottom with not at the bottom, but well down on the scale of housing market responsiveness with an elasticity of about 0.4. New construction is important, but except in the very long run, most housing, especially most affordable housing, comes from the existing stock. Given time, we won't spend as much time as this topic deserves today. I'll just note here that a lot of this outside of public production, most affordable housing comes from the process we call filtering. As homes age, they often filter down to become affordable. And there are different ways that we measure this, as we can discuss another day. Filtering can work in both directions. Upward filtering is called gentrification, and most markets have some of both. The question is how much of either, and what can we do to facilitate the kind of dynamic change we need in our particular housing market. So hopefully we can tackle this more another day. I'll end with just a few questions that I hope we can discuss throughout the conference. I won't read them here, and we'll get into these in the discussion. So now today, let me end. I'm a little over time. Let me end by thanking you again for the opportunity and your attention. And I look forward to the conference. Don't hesitate to contact me if you want the longer version of these remarks. Thank you very much.